even the basis for the arising of another and still more peculiar movement, this time among what are called the Babylonian New Homists, among just those beings of that time who studied and produced what are called new combinations of concentrations of vibrations, which act in a definite way on the sense of smell of the beings, and which produce definite effects in their general psyche, that is to say, among those beings there who made it their aim to find the truth by means of smells. Certain beings, who were then enthused by this, founded, in imitation of the followers of the said branch of painters, a similar society, and the motto of their new movement was to search the truth in the shades of smells obtained between the moment of the action of cold at freezing and the moment of the action at warm decomposition. Like the painters, they also then found between these said two definite smells about 700 very definite shades, which they employed in their elucidating experiments. I do not know to what these two peculiar movements then in Babylon would have led, and where they would have ceased, if a newly appointed chief of the city, during the time we were there, had not begun prosecuting the followers of that second new movement, because, with their already sufficiently keen sense of smell, they had begun to notice and unwittingly to expose certain of his what are called shady dealings, with the result that he used every possible means to suppress everything conducted not only with that second new movement, but with the first as well. As regards that organ of theirs about which we began to speak, namely the organ for the perception of the visibility of other cosmic arisings which were beyond them, the deterioration of its sensibility, continuing also after the Babylonian period, reached the point that during our last stay on the surface of this planet, your favorites already had the possibility of perceiving and distinguishing, instead of the 1,921,600 tonalities of color which they ought to have perceived and distinguished, only the result of the penultimate what is called sevenfold crystallization of the white ray, that is 49 tonalities. And even then only some of your favorites had that capacity, while the rest, perhaps the majority, were deprived of even this possibility. But what is most interesting in respect of this progressive deterioration of that most important part of their common presence is the sorry farce that results, namely, that those contemporary three-brained beings there who can still manage to distinguish the mentioned miserable fraction of the total number of tonalities, namely merely 49, look down with superior self-conceit and with an admixture of the impulse of pride upon those other beings who have lost the capacity to distinguish even this miserable number, as upon beings with abnormal deficiency in that said organ of theirs, and they call them diseased, afflicted by what is called Daltonism. The last 7 blendings of the gravity center vibrations of the white ray, which just as now among the contemporary beings there they then had in Babylon, have the following names: 1. Red. 2. Orange. 3. Yellow. 4. Green. 5. Blue. 6. Indigo. 7. Violet. Now, hear in just which way the learned beings then in Babylon belonging to the group of painters indicated various useful information and fragments of the knowledge they had attained in the lawful inexactitudes of the great cosmic law then called the law of sevenfoldness. by means of the combinations of the mentioned 7 independent definite colors and other secondary tonalities ensuing from them, in accordance with that definite property of the common integral vibration, that is, of the white ray, during the process of its transformations about which I have just spoken, and which was already then familiar to the Babylonian learned painters. One of its gravity center vibrations, or one of the separate colors of the white ray, always ensues from another and is transformed into a third. As for example, the orange color is obtained from the red, and further itself passes in its turn into yellow, and so on and so forth. So whenever the Babylonian learned painters wove or embroidered with colored threads or colored their productions, they inserted the distinctions of the tonalities of the colors in the cross lines, as well as in the horizontal lines, and even in the intersecting lines of color, not in the lawful sequence in which this process really proceeds, in accordance with the law of sevenfoldness, but otherwise. And in these also lawful otherwises, they placed the contents of some or other information or knowledge. On Thursdays, namely the days which the learned beings of this group assigned for sacred and popular dances, there were demonstrated, with the necessary explanations, every possible form of religious and popular dances, either those already existing, which they only modified, or quite new ones which they had created. And in order that you should have a better idea and well understand in which way they indicated what they wished in these dances, you must know that the learned beings of this time had already long been aware that every posture and movement of every being in general, in accordance with the same law of sevenfoldness, always consists of 7 what are called mutually balanced tensions, arising in 7 independent parts of their whole, and that each of these parts, in their turn, consists of 7 different what are called lines of movement, and each line has 7 what are called points of dynamic concentration. And all this that I've just described, being repeated in the same way and in the same sequence, but always on a diminishing scale, is actualized in the minutest sizes of the total bodies called atoms. And so, during their dances, in the movements lawful in their accordance with each other, these learned dancers inserted intentional inexactitudes, also lawful, and in a certain way indicated in them the information and knowledge which they wished to transmit. On Fridays, days devoted to sculpture, the learned beings belonging to this group brought and demonstrated what were then called minia images or models, and which were made from the material there called clay. Those minia images or models which they brought for exhibition and familiarization represented, as a rule, individual beings or various groups of beings, either similar to them or of other beings of all kinds of exterior form breeding on their planet. Among these productions were also various what are called allegorical beings, which were represented with the head of one form of a being there, with the body of another, and with the limbs of a third, and so on. The learned beings belonging to this group indicated all that was requisite in the lawful inexactitudes allowed by them in connection with what was then called the law of dimensions.